أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today we're going to continue our session inshallah, and we're going to start off with a check-in to see how everyone's doing, how you've been assessing yourselves, how you've been setting goals for yourself, how you're facing your challenges, how you're adapting and navigating whatever circumstances you're facing, adapting to them, and trying to figure out how to navigate most effectively. And if there's any assessments that you're doing, what kind are they? How are they working out? If you have any tips or questions, then this is the time, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. I've been trying to clarify the goals that I had more. So I've been writing out different aspects. I think last time I mentioned Islamic goals, that the tangible one is learning Quran, or the exam that I have to take for my work. And I've just been trying to write out more of those, the long-term and short-term ones, and also how it connects back to why I'm doing it. And yeah.
Okay. So you're taking a more proactive stance in terms of more proactive and more involved effort, essentially, to continue forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I've had to just focus on really short-term goals for the time being. I haven't been able to really project too far as my goals go. Alhamdulillah. I think when I get really stressed or bogged down with a lot of various things, then I tend to make the short-term goals and really focus on those, knowing that once I get through that spot, then I'll be able to, get back into my longer-term goals.
Okay, so you're taking it step by step and trying to see how the short-term goals go, to see how sustainable they would be, for example, to be able to map out something for a longer term.
Right. I guess sometimes it ends up being, maybe not directly a part of my long-term goal, but it's something that you have to do nonetheless.
Yeah. Do you have an idea of what kind of long-term goals that you have? Or are you still mapping those out?
I'm still mapping those out. I mean, some of the general long-term goals are still there, but I need a more solid plan on how to actually reach them through my shorter term goals.
Okay. Okay. And are your long-term goals more, do you have an idea of how to map them out, or are they, are you unsure about how to go about going towards the long-term goals, or even mapping them out, or detailing them, and so on?
No, I have an idea about how to go about it. It's just not sure which path I want to take to get there, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes sense, because what we were doing just now is the first step was, or the step 0 was sort of, being realistic about things. And then step 1 was to have an end goal, right? And then step 2 was to sort of assess where you stand currently relative to those end goals. Or it could be that you're deciding what the end goals are based on where you stand today, right? But they would still technically, in the broader scheme of things, right? They would still be where in that order, where you have the vision first, and then you have short-term goals and stuff, right? You have an assessment after that. So step 1 is generally overall going to be the first step, the vision, but then the second step would be assessment, and this is the general thing. This is the overall higher goals that you have in life, right? But then more, I guess, more involved, more focused, internally, you might have a situation where you do assessments before visions and stuff, right? But ultimately, we have a goal in life which is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the hereafter, and so on. So that end vision is the ultimate overarching sort of vision, right? And then we have step 2, analysis of where we are, and then kind of going from there. But then sometimes, yeah, you might say, for example, okay, today I am at this surah, for example, in memorization, right? And then I want to be at a certain point by the end of the year, that I and um, or actually, based on my current pace, let's talk about paces then, right? My current assessment says that my pace that I can sustain is this much. So let me set a goal according to that for 1 year. So if I do this every year, by the end of the year, I should be able to get to this point. So that I'll set that as my goal, right? But then again, so in that case, step 2 came before step 1. However, in the ultimate scenario, that goal of trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preceded any other steps that you took, right? So there's 2 layers that are happening over here. But the overarching one is gonna have a vision first, and then you're gonna have assessments. But then the current one, or sorry, the smaller one, the smaller level, or the lower level, would be where you would actually get involved into maybe like assessment first and then a vision, or sometimes you'll have a vision first and assessment next or whatever, but those are like the secondary levels. So um, as long as you have an overall ultimate goal, then you can uh, see how you want to get there, and you'll be doing assessments. Now, the reason I mention this is because we haven't actually gone into the step 3 yet, which is actually like the process of how to get to point B from point A. So if you haven't figured out how to do that yet, that's okay, because we haven't even gone into that yet. But if you're doing that already, that's great. And then, whatever you've gone through in terms of your experience, trying to go from point A to point B, will be useful, inshallah, when we get to that next. Okay. Do you guys have any tips on, or any questions or anything?
I think it does help to have the visuals with it, when you have your goals set, and then to visually see that pathway. I guess if you're a visual learner, then that may be more helpful. Um,
Yeah, I think, and also, I think, most of us try to visualize something in our heads. We map out something, we have an idea of what something looks like and so on. I mean, we imagine it. So when we're imagining it, we are visualizing it essentially. And we're not sort of just like, when we're thinking about something, we're thinking about places and people and, concepts and stuff. And a lot of it is visual, right? And so I think most of us, if not every single human being, is probably going to think about things visually. In fact, even memories would be, everything put together, the entire sense, the compendium of all the senses, the information that's coming in from there, it's going to be what you're going to sort of think about and so on. So when you have dreams, it's all visual. When you think about things and stuff, it's going to be visual and stuff, right? When you're daydreaming, for example, or when you're actually sleeping and you're dreaming and stuff, right? A lot of that is visual stuff. Um, so definitely visualizing helps us in terms of navigating, yeah. And the visualization of the vision itself, that would be the end result. Like when I get there, what is it that I'm gonna see, right? What is it at the end of the day, right? So that's not necessarily the process of going from A to B, but that's just point B. This is like, for example, I want to go to the masjid, but what does the masjid look like, right? I need to be able to visualize what it looks like. So as soon as I see it, I'm going to be able to realize that that's the masjid. I'm going to be like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for, right? So when you're looking for a building or like a person's house, for example, you sort of have an idea what to look for, right? So when like you maybe it's an address that you're looking for. So when you see that address, you're like, oh, okay, I'm here, right? So something like that. Yeah, so that would be the end vision that you're visualizing. But the process going from point A to point B is going to be a different, it's going to be separate topic. Okay, so if nobody has anything else, inshallah, we'll go ahead and continue. And here's what I was talking about just now. The current status, right, is what we're looking at right now. This is the assessment we're at today. And the end vision is where we want to be. And we said that the broader, like the higher level, is where we have an end vision for our life, right? The end vision for our life, meaning what we want to do before we die, essentially, right? Because this is what's going to show up in the Day of Judgment. And then through that process, or after we're having this vision, real understood or mapped out, then we go into an assessment where we stand today, so we can go towards that end vision. So that's why this is step 1 and that's step 2. But when we're doing individual milestones within that vision, right, that's where we can do the other way around as well. But that'd be a lower level and not the ultimate level. That's what I was referring to over here. So for example, I know that I want to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by memorizing Quran or like doing something, right? So in the case of memorization of Quran, I want to memorize it. So I'm like, okay, but that's still the end vision first, and then you have the current status of where I'm at when it comes to memorization of the Quran. But let me pace myself a certain way. So I say, okay, what is my current speed at which I'm memorizing, so that I can have a milestone or like a goal for at the end of the year where I can get to based on my current speed with which I'm memorizing. So that would be putting the inventory first, and then doing the end vision or the goal second. But again, that would be considered more of a goal towards the broader end vision, right? So we're just using different word terminology, but technically it is still a vision, but we're just using goals to give you an understanding of that. So at the end of the year, for example, you want to have memorized one juz'ah, for example, right? That might be your end vision, but we're gonna call that a goal to differentiate between vision and goal, so people don't get confused and stuff, right? So keep that in mind. So, but technically they are the same things. Okay, so we're gonna go over that after we finish this section, inshallah, and how to set goals and so on, and then how to be sustainable and things like that. Okay, now let's jump into the stories. And I got your feedback, and you guys wanted like your fewer stories and spending more time on individual stories than to take snippet like more stories and smaller connections to those stories, essentially, right? So what we're doing is we're going to pick one story, we're going to go from there. This is something that you guys might have all experienced in one way or another, right? In 2009, there was this proposal by two organizations. One of them was the National Governors Association, and then there was another one, which was an organization that brings the chief officers of different educational institutions together. So these are two organizations came together and they did a report. And in this report, they realized that they were falling behind, especially in math, for example, but also in English. They realized they were falling behind compared to other countries in the world. And so the vision was that they wanted to have a competitive edge in the world, and they wanted to have student success in the real world, meaning they wanted to have their students be able to compete at the global level, but also be competent in terms of what the employers were looking for from their employees and so on. So the idea was college and career readiness, and making sure that our students had an edge when it came to the global market, but also in the national, meaning the U.S. market and so on, when it comes to companies and so on. Okay, so this was the vision, with Common Core, but also it was like a general educational vision, right? That we wanted our students to be very successful in the real world and so on. And so the previous standards that were being used by different states were very different from each other. So there was no standardization, right? And the idea is similar to, if you look at what I said here, lawyers and therapists, right? So lawyers and therapists, for example, they have state-bounded, I guess, like domains where they can practice, right? So if they go to a different state, they have to take another test, and they can practice their law or their medicine or whatever in those areas and stuff, right? So for a therapist, they have to be certified, they have to be licensed by the state licensing board for their whatever the field is that they're doing, right? So this is something that makes them limited to the boundaries within which they are in. That's it. And the lawyers are similar, right? And one of the reasons is for lawyers, for example, is because the laws of the state, right, are different from state to state. And so you need to know your state's laws, and because there's different laws across different states, then obviously you need to know the differences if you go from one state to the next and so on. Now keep in mind that the federal government has certain powers, but then the state governments also have certain powers. And the founding fathers, when they were setting up the Constitution, they had this back and forth in terms of how much power should the federal government have and how much power should the state governments have, right? because each state would then be considered its own autonomous unit, or its own entity, right? Legal entities, essentially, you want to say. And then the federal government will sort of oversee the entire thing, but at the same time give power downwards and stuff like that. So there are certain things where the federal government cannot supersede state governments, and there are certain things that the state governments need the federal government for, and they sort of fall under that jurisdiction. So there was this sort of like balance of power and stuff like that, right? And this was so that everyone could be appeased, moving forward. So this is how the founding fathers set it up. And so naturally, the states have different laws, different rules, different regulations and stuff. As you know, some states, for example, may not charge, let's say, food taxes or whatever, and other states might. Some others might charge a certain amount for taxes, and other states might charge different amounts and stuff, right? So they have some sort of autonomy in terms of setting these things for themselves. And you might notice as well for the city government, for example, or the like county governments, for example, or like, at least like the organizations that oversee these projects under them, at those levels, they're going to have certain things that they're going to be going by, and certain things that they're going to be different when it comes to different counties, for example. So taxes in Wake County might be different than than Durham County or Orange County or whatever county, because of local, whatever they decided to do among themselves. So Common Core standards had, before Common Core standards, the state standards were very different. And so if you graduated from, let's say, California, right, that type of rigor or whatever that you went through, whatever education you went through, was very different than if you went to, for example, New York, or you went to Texas, right? And so a student coming out from any of these states, it was very hard for people to look at them and say, okay, this person has studied this, right? So you might have taken, let's say, AP Calculus, AB, right? Let's say you took the first calculus, and you took it in a high school in, let's say, California. And then you went to North Carolina, and another person took AP Calculus over there. And another one took AP Calculus, let's say, in Alabama, right? So the state standards by which they were measuring certain things, right, might be very different. And I shouldn't say AP because AP is actually more standardized. Let me say, for example, Algebra 1, right? So Algebra 1, if you took it in these three states, the person coming out after graduating from this may have very different understanding of math, especially Algebra 1, because they had different standards by which they were assessed and different things that they were taught, right? I don't mean like, completely different like things, but like, if you understand what I mean, like just how they were assessed, what kind of formatting that they were being taught with, and so on. It was different across different states. So a person coming in, I don't know how competent this person is going to be. Who is more competent, the student in Alabama, or the student in North Carolina, or the student in California, or are they all at the same level, right? And because of the fact that they had different ways that they were being assessed and taught and so on. So SAT is a way where it's everyone in the entire country, right, can take the SAT, and when they take the SAT, what ends up happening is they end up being compared to everyone else across the country. So it's a very standardized thing. Now I can see where everyone is relative to everyone else. So a college would, ideally be able to look at these and look at the scores for all the students, regardless of the state that they're coming from, and then apply a prescription and say, okay, here, this person seems to have a higher score, which means relative to all their peers across the country, regardless of which schooling that they went through, which standard they went through, they're going to be able to perform better than this other student who had a lower SAT score. So that was the idea behind standardization. And same thing with AP and IB and MCAT and GMAT and LSAT and all those exams that are standardized tests, right? So just keep that in mind, that regardless of where you're coming from, it makes it easy for people like employers or colleges or graduate schools or higher schooling or whatever, for them to look at you based on a standardized criteria, then and then not having to sort of like figure out, okay, based on what are the standards in California compared to Alabama, and then kind of analyze them and assess them and try to figure out then which person is more competent because of where they're coming from and stuff. And so it'd be really complicated. So to simplify the process, this was the idea. Now, as a result of Common Core standards, because of the Governors Association and the other organization, when they came together, they proposed that why don't we standardize across the country, like a system where if a person graduates from North Carolina, right, with a certain, like let's say algebra 1, then their like this, the tests that they're going to be taking, the results from them are going to be standardized in the sense that they're going to be comparable to a student who graduates from Alabama with the same the standards and measures and so on, right? As also compared to the person in California, or a person in Texas, or a person in New York, or a person in Louisiana, or a person in Missouri, wherever they are, right? All across the board, any college, for example, can look at these grades and say, okay, then this right here, I can actually compare to somebody else because they're using the same kind of testing. They're using the same kind of teaching styles and so on, right? So that was the idea. And so so again, this was because they realized that they were falling behind in the world. And number two, they realized that they were not standardized among themselves. So it was very hard for people to figure out, like, okay, who was actually more competent than others people and stuff, right? So here's a report that I have over here. So you can see over here that um, American education has not adequately responded to these new challenges. And those new challenges are that they realized that a lot of the other countries were actually succeeding, and they had education as their core criteria for success as the country, right? So for example, in Singapore, Germany, China, Brazil, Korea, and other countries around the world, educational improvement is viewed as a critical part of that mission, right? To raise the race is on among the nations to create knowledge, field, innovation economies, right? So for that mission, the education improvement was one of the criteria, one of the high criteria in these countries. So nations and states are therefore working hard to benchmark their education systems to establish a solid foundation for economic development in the 21st century. Now, if you look at this, the idea again is so that you can compete. If you look down a little bit here, I want to show you something. So it says American education has not adequately responded to these new challenges. The United States is falling behind other countries in the resource that matters most in the new global economy, the human capital, right? American 15-year-olds ranked 25th in math and 21st in science achievement on the most recent international assessment conducted in 2006. Now, this is an old document, and that's why I'm saying that. So I believe this is in 2008, I think, when they wrote this, something like this. So they were justifying, what is this, 2000, I think it's 2008. Yeah, 2008 right there. So this is their justification. This is their analysis when they realize, this is before Common Core. So this was their justification of why we need to have something like Common Core. Common again, meaning it's the same across the board, right? So they realized this because when they did this study, they realized how far behind the U.S. was falling compared to the world and stuff, right? So notice over here, at the same time, the U.S. ranked high in inequity, meaning they had large gaps in science scores and other things, right, between different classes. Classes meaning socioeconomic groups, right? And I shouldn't say classes, I should say groups. But yeah, the idea is that they realized that there was inequity. If you're living, for example, New Orleans, right? The difference of your education over there compared to the education of somebody, say, in Boston, right? Um, it may be very significant. And that right there is unequal in a way, right? In the sense that you're not getting equitable treatment, and you're not able to get the same kind of access, or the same access to high quality education. And so, this is causing problems in the grand scheme of things and stuff, right? So now the idea is if we standardize everything, everyone's going to get the same quality of education. Okay, so there's more information obviously over here. Like they said, as recently as 1995, America still tied in first in college and university graduation, but 10 years later, had dropped to 14th place. The same year, it had the second highest college dropout rate of 27 countries. So this made them feel very overwhelmed, and they said, okay, you know what, we're falling behind. We're not keeping up with the other countries, and so the students, American students, are going to fall behind, and other people are going to take their jobs that they would have gotten otherwise and stuff. So there was just all these concerns and so on. Anyways, so you can read this document over here and go from there, but the idea was just for you to see what's happening over here and what was the justification for Common Core. There's a lot, obviously, like there's all these right here that I have tabs open. It's about Common Core, and if I have time, maybe I'll go through them. But I just had them, in case I have time, inshallah. So this one right here, let's look at North Carolina. So this was an assessment done, and in 2010, and yeah, 2010, And notice over here that North Carolina was labeled that, North Carolina's English was graded at a D. This is before Common Core, I believe, right? And so, actually, right after Common Core, probably, or maybe actually, this is like when they were adopting Common Core. So that they're actually assessing what was before Common Core, which was the North Carolina Standard course of study. So that was the standard course of study, not the Common Core. And so that right there, gave, it was a level. The grade was D because it was very vague and it wasn't really defining things, well and so on. So this is what this was how it was in terms of the assessment for North Carolina. Now let's look at, for example, New York, or let's say New Jersey. Okay, so English over there, based on what they were using, right, the core curriculum, content standards, so that they got a level, they got a grade of C because of these metrics over here that they were judging by. Okay, so this is a little bit better than North Carolina. And now let's look at, for example, California.
Our 15-minute timer.
Okay. Okay, and then this is California. And look at over here. They were actually really good. And so for them, they had a grade A. So you see, there was an extreme difference in terms of North Carolina standards versus California standards versus New Jersey standards, right? So some states were really good and some states were not really good. So there was this is what they meant by inequity, that not everyone was getting the same access to things, the resources and education and so on, compared to their peers in other states, for example. And so these two things made them feel like, okay, there needs to be some sort of standardization. We want to make sure that everyone across the board gets the same education, they get the same tools, they get the same learning and stuff, and they're also tested the same way, essentially, right? So it'd be like as if we're treating the US entirely as one big thing, right? As opposed to having each state have its own separate thing. Let's all unite sort of as a nation, essentially, right? So this was what happened, essentially. Now this gives you some more details on the assessments that had taken place, and for them to realize, it's for them to justify essentially how to move forward, right? So they were actually assessing um, the coherence over here, the curricular coherence, right? Okay, going back to this now. Let's continue here. Okay, so just another comparison over here is, for example, if you graduate from NC State, right, or if you graduate from UNC Chapel Hill, or you graduate from another accredited institution, then that accreditation is something that other institutions would recognize, right? So you might have a national accreditation, or you might have regional accreditation, or you might have distance learning accreditation. But the accreditation is that it's something that if another body recognizes that accreditation, then in that case they're going to accept the student to the next level up, right? So that if you have an undergraduate degree and you're applying from one institution to the next one, if the institution, the receiving institution accepts your undergraduate whatever, then they're going to allow you to get into their graduate level program, for example, right? So because they're acknowledging that, right? So this is the idea over here also, that having some sort of standardization like that, it helps in terms of figuring out, okay, what's the rigor, what's the quality of education and so on, until you can go from there. But if you don't have that kind of rigor and like the accreditation and stuff, then it's hard for people, for institutions to see if the content that, or if the student, whatever they learned, if they're ready for the next level up at the receiving institution. Receiving meaning they're receiving the student, and licenses, meaning driving licenses, for example. You get them from your state, but you can are allowed to drive in different states and stuff like that. So they allow, as long as you have a license, you can go to different states and stuff. Although it's different states may have some slightly different rules and regulations and stuff. For example, in some states you're not allowed to turn right unless you have a green light. Whereas in some states you can if there's no incoming traffic and so on, even if it's red light and stuff like that, right? So that's one of the differences, for example. And then passports. You have a passport that allows you to go from one country to another country, right? That's some sort of standardization, some sort of understanding. Okay, this person belongs to this country, for example. and it's recognized by other people and so on, right? But it is something that limits you to that particular country in terms of rights and all that stuff. So if you have an American passport, you're an American citizen, for example, then in that case, you're going to be able to go to other countries and you're going to be given the rights of an American citizen, but not necessarily the rights of the locals of that particular country you're visiting, right? So keep that in mind. This is sort of like licenses for the for lawyers and therapists and so on as well. They're bound by certain boundaries outside of which they don't have the same rights and so on, or they don't have the same allowance to practice their whatever that they're doing and stuff. So this right here was the issue. This is the background on this, right? Now, what happened in this case? The good and the bad, or the good and the contested, I said. So the good was that obviously it was focusing on competency. It was focused on like having a certain rigor so we can actually compete with other countries, for example. It was focusing on standardization, so institutions and corporations and whoever is going to hire you is able to, or even if you're going to go to a higher level education, for them that they're going to enroll you in, right? They're going to accept you as students. They needed some sort of standardization, just like SATs, APs, IB, and so on, right? To understand where you are relative to your peers who are also applying to the same institution or the same company or whatever it is, right? And to make it so that you have a global edge. So in other words, you needed to be ready for the real world in the sense of in the sense of career readiness, but also college readiness and so on. So they needed to make sure that you have that kind of I guess the portfolio or the profile, right? Okay. Now on the other hand, the stuff that they gave out was focused a lot of, I think I mentioned over here, yeah. So it was focused a lot on critical thinking. Now before this, it was a little bit more memorization. You just had to learn how to use this formula or just whatever. You had to just understand, memorize certain things, and go from there. Right? But now they're asking you the why questions. Well, why does this work? That it works, and I'm telling you it'll work, and you just apply it in this scenario and that scenario, and just assume it works. You're good to go. But why does it work? That wasn't being asked as much. So they started to actually have you write essays essentially for your first grade and second grade or third grade math. So they're gonna have you doing like an explanation and justification. They're gonna give you a problem, for example, and then they're gonna have a bunch of lines below it where you have to justify why you're doing something or how or why would you find the area in a certain way that you would find it. So you had to not only explain the process, but you had to explain why this process as opposed to a different process. This is Common Core, right? Before that, you just had to solve the problem, you had to show the work, and you're done. You didn't have to justify why that process works and why you didn't use a different process. So this is where it became a little bit more involved and intense, right? And the idea was why analyze things instead. Why is this working? Why does it not work? Why this other thing is working? Whatever. How do I solve this particular situation in this particular context? Whatever it is, right? And then they also had you focus a little bit more on technical skills, but also writing skills, right? And this is something that was not as heavily emphasized in many of the curricula before in different states and so on. Khan Academy is an example of sort of standardization. So they took Common Core. They actually sat down with the people that do the SAT, and they aligned the Common Core to actually SAT had this revision where they aligned the SAT to be more like the Common Core. Essentially, if you are able to successfully navigate the Common Core, you should therefore be able to do really good in SAT. Right? This is different than before because in the past they were measuring certain things that may not have connected to real life or what you're going to need in the future and so on. Right? And so the SAT was disconnected from the curriculum of a particular state, and the curriculum in particular state were obviously also disconnected and different from each other, right? And so there was all this sort of arbitrary standards by which they were going. So if you go from one state, then you have its own standards compared to another one. But then even the SAT was not necessarily connected to the curriculum that you were studying in your school, and it therefore also may not have been connected to actual practice in real life of this kind of skills that you need in your job or in higher education or whatever it was, right? So for example, they had the I don't know if you guys remember back in the day, they used to have the analogies. So one word compared to one another word, so this to this is the same as this to what, and they would ask you to answer that or whatever. Um, So that might not have been something that may have been necessary for you to be a successful person in the real world, in the job economy, or in the jobs in the economy, in terms of the jobs that you're going to be taking on, right? Or in the education that you'll be pursuing at a higher level than the, like the after high school, for example. So Khan Academy sat with the people that were doing SAT, and then since SAT was now more aligned to Common Core, which is the standard of learning for all of, many of the states that adopted them, or some form of it that they adopted. Therefore, it became easier for Khan Academy to have one simple training process, right? And so they became the official study partners for SAT. So if you go to SAT right now, College Board, and you want to take the SAT, the official practice that SAT recommends, the College Board recommends, is Khan Academy, right? And so now Khan Academy is actually linked to specific standards. So for example, for math, you might say, I don't know, like for example, geometry, right? So the geometry code is G, and then you might say dot, and you might mention which portion, which level it is. For example, like if it's third grade, fourth grade, it'll have a number for that. So maybe let's say 3 for third grade, and then it'll say dot, like something else. For example, maybe like that whatever the curriculum is for third grade for math, it's broken down into subcategories, right? And so they'll say, for example, I don't know, like shapes, for example, right? And then it'll have something else and something else, right? So whatever it is, whatever category it is, it'll put that letter there. So it'd be like 3.G, for example, or whatever, G, and then 3, and then like, whatever category it is. And then within that category, whatever subcategory it is that you're focusing on, it'll make that note as well, right? So this is how it works. And then the types of questions that you're going to get in there are going to be connected to that, right? So Khan Academy's SAT practice is going to show something, and then it'll be linked back to something on the SAT that the SAT was measuring in terms of a code. So the code and the type of questions that are attached to the code are going to be shown based on that. And the same thing for when you're doing the regular grade levels in Khan Academy for math or whatever. So it's all connected to a particular code. So if you don't do good in a particular code, that's going to show up. So if your teacher is assigning you problems on Khan Academy, and then the results show that particular codes were your weak points, then the teacher knows this, and that'll be what they can focus on individually. They can assign you more practice on those specific codes, right? And then you'll be good to go on that. So you're using technology, you're leveraging the power of technology, but also the idea of standardization. So you can go through multi-organizations, like between multi-organizations, multiple organizations, and then like come up with student success essentially at the end of the day. So it's like the idea of raising a kid it takes a village to raise a kid, for example, right? So this is the idea of here. Everyone's working together. They have the same mindset. They have the same understanding. So this was, in theory, the idea that went behind it. Okay. So on the other hand, though, the teaching that many of the teachers had, or like the teaching skills, right, or the training that they went through to be certified as teachers, right? Again, so they needed certifications, and the certifications help in terms of standardization process, right? To make sure that a teacher who's coming in is certified, then that teacher is trained for that curriculum that they're going to be teaching, right? And the certification process helps, hiring agencies understand this right there. So a teacher comes in with a certain understanding of certain standards that were there before. Now, if new standards are brought out, right, then what that means is that teachers have to go through a learning process to learn the new standards. They have to learn the new codes. They have to learn the kind of questions that fall under which code and which code they don't fall under, and so on. You have to relearn the process because everything has been redesigned essentially, right? And you have to understand what other tools to use, and how like what kind of testing process is going to take place, and so on. So one of the things that they were doing is they were doing benchmarks, meaning they want to see, they have like a goal. So if you're coming into the second grade and you want to graduate second grade, then in math, for example, in reading, you need to go from this level to this level, and they have numbers for those, right? So you might go from a reading level of this to a reading level of this, and they have broken down into letters of the alphabet. So you might be at level M, for example, and then you might be by the end of it, by the end of the year, you might have to be at level like O, for example, right? And so the idea is to take those level, progressions, and divide them into semesters, or not semesters, quarters, and even those quarters to a daily like system, right? So you'll have, for example, teachers getting in their, in their set of papers, for example, or whatever preparation material they have, they'll say, for example, day one, and they'll say day two, day three, day four, day five. So it has an entire systematic breakdown from day one until the end day for that curriculum for that year, right? And then they have benchmarks at the end, at the beginning of the school year to figure out where the student is starting off. Then they also have it sometime, let's say in the middle of the quarter or at the end of the quarter. And then they're going to do this repeatedly until the end of the year because they want to see what kind of progress students are actually making over the course of the year, right? And if they realize that many of the students are not able to make progress towards their end of the quarter benchmark, right? Whatever it is that they're trying to get to, if they're not making that progress and it's happening across, for example, a particular classroom, then it might be, so maybe the teacher needs more help or maybe the resources that they have available are not enough or whatever, something's going wrong over there. So that you can localize it to a particular classroom. Or if it's something where the entire school is having issues because each school might have multiple different teachers for the same grade level, right? So the third grade teachers, there might be like 5 or 6 third grade teachers, for example. So in that case, what you need to do is to make sure that like all the teachers there have the proper training and whatever that they need for or and the resources to be able to effectively pursue like those benchmarks and stuff that they have. Like these are the milestone markers and stuff like that they're evaluating whether students are actually making progress towards them or not, right? And if they are not making that progress, then what is it that we can do to sort of intervene and or like have an intervention process so the students can get extra practice in something. For example, the teacher might say, okay, go to this, for example, I think it's called IXL. So that's like a math practice thing. You can go here and we're going to assign you these codes, right, for whatever standard it is that you're weak in, and you need to go home and practice this many problems every single day, for example, right? But that would be customized for that particular student who's struggling in that particular area, as opposed to his peer in the same classroom. It is different. Is the time over?
Yes.
Okay, I'm almost done, so inshallah will be okay. So that was that. But then on top of that, the parent support, because now the parents may have grown up going through a different standard of study than the ones that their kids are now facing, right? So for example, let's say the current students, their parents might have gone through the previous standards, and so these new standards of, like, for example, asking questions like the why questions, right? Why did you find the area of this rectangle in this way? And like, for example, they'll say, find the area of this rectangle, but then you have to justify why this process actually works. You can't just say, okay, length times width and I'm done, right? I have to explain in words, in sentences, in paragraphs, in the section below, why this works. Now, for most parents, it's like, wait, I didn't do this. How am I going to explain this? Because I don't know why this happened. I know it worked, but I didn't really remember why it worked. Now my student is expected to do this. So this caused a lot of pushback from a lot of parents because they're like, okay, my kids are definitely not able to handle this because I wasn't able to handle this, or because I don't know how to help them, right? And because this is a new thing, maybe I don't have the resources yet to be able to help them. And so I'm confused and I don't know how to get help, and my students are struggling, my kids are struggling, and so I don't like this. I want to go back to what was done before, what was tried and tested, essentially what worked before, right? And so this is the pushback that there is currently taking place in some of the states, right? And then the student preparedness. So in terms of if you're using a new system, especially if you're using new standards and stuff, and you're using like a new technological system, like a software or something like that, that wasn't being used before, that the students have to get you're used to that. And then you have another issue, which is that, okay, if a student was going through school until, let's say, third grade, or let's say fourth grade or fifth grade, let's say into elementary school, and they were using the previous standards, right? But now they go to sixth grade and suddenly a new system is in place that is, and their level compared to that new level, right, is below, because let's say their state had more relaxed standards before, and so their current level um, on the old standards might have been a sixth grade level, right? But then on the same topic with the Common Core standards, their level might actually end up being a fifth or fourth grade level, but they're actually sitting in a sixth grade classroom because that's where they just graduated from fifth grade. Now they're going to sixth grade. So now they come in and they realize that the sixth grade material, which would have been for Common Core, which requires them to actually know the levels before, now they're expected to know all this stuff, which they actually don't, because obviously they went through a different standard, until fifth grade. So now they find everything very difficult. Now they feel like I should have been able to do sixth grade stuff because I had all A's in my previous grades and stuff. But now I can't do anything in sixth grade because what is this? What are they asking me? They never asked us these kind of questions about the whys and the critical thinking and all that stuff. Now they get overwhelmed. So the students became overwhelmed as well. And then there was the politics, because now if you see that your schools are not actually having this kids graduate with like higher grades, for example, then how do you navigate that, right? Because now you're going to be like, okay, the school systems are failing and stuff, and politically, whoever is the leader is going to be the one that's going to have to take the blame for it, right? Because they're overseeing all this stuff. And then they're going to say, for example, to the mayors, the governors, for example, hey, you guys are the ones that are making our students fail and stuff, and we don't want this and stuff, and our kids are not going to be able to um, compete in the global market because now their grades are lower than their peers potentially. Everyone is thinking like that potentially. So that puts a lot of heaviness on the politicians themselves. And these politicians are not trained teachers or whatever and stuff. So for them, it's a lot harder to understand what kind of resources and stuff they can provide teachers and so on, what kind of resources they can provide parents and students and stuff. So they try to have other people sort of help them out, but then they also give them specific metrics, and those metrics that the other people that are trying to address the situation may not find useful, because the politicians obviously are not like instructors and teachers and so on, so they don't understand how that works. But they might give unrealistic expectations from their teachers, from their students, from their school boards and stuff, from the people that are actually tasked to fix the problem that the parents are complaining about, for example, or the teachers are complaining about, because they feel like they're not trained for these things because they've been teaching for 20 years with a different standard, and now a new standard comes in and they have to learn the standard themselves and so on. And so they're struggling with this. So all of these things, and the idea that people, it's hard for people to have patience and stuff, right? Especially when they want to have deadlines, they want to have systems in place and so on, and their reputation and other things are on the line, right? So what ends up happening at the end of the day is that the people start contesting and saying, okay, we no longer want the Common Core, and we no longer, or at least we want to delay the Common Core's implementation, right? So these are the challenges that come up at the end of the day. So what happened over here, that when they did the assessments, right, and that's what we're talking about today, the inventory, they realized that the world is falling, or that the US is falling behind in terms of their education system, right? And other countries, the US's competitors, the competitors of the United States, they are ahead in terms of education, and so the United States is actually falling behind. And if the United States falls behind in education and career readiness and jobs and the rigor of their standards and so on, then instead of people coming to American institutions for education, instead of the United States being the leader in all these things, other countries are going to take that lead now. And so the United States is no longer going to be the most advanced or whatever and stuff, right? So these are worries that people have, and as a result of that, they end up having. So as a result, they instituted a new system, but the new system again needs time, and they need training, and they need all these things and stuff, right? But at the same time, obviously, as you know, teachers don't get paid much and stuff, right? So there's this thing where, okay, access to resources like money and like training and all that stuff may be very limited, right? And as a result of that, not everything goes along with that ideal scenario of keeping up with the rest of the world, because you're not actually for example, we have one of the largest budgets for the military, right? And that's that. So it's as if the military is the thing that's going to protect the US in terms of how the world perceives the US, and how the Americans are going to be ready compared to their peers in the rest of the world and stuff, right? And so uh, given that that's not necessarily the case, that the education, like other countries like Germany and Singapore and so on, that like they did, if we did the same thing, then maybe we're going to actually be able to compete with the rest of the world. So the idea of um, priorities and so on was another issue over here. So the idea was good, but the practicality of it, given all the moving pieces and stuff, is something that's being discussed right now. And so I wanted to give you this case study to show you how in the real world how things end up happening, and the issues that arise because of that. The idea was good, it could have been practical, but then at the same time, the realistic situation was that there's going to be a lot of back and forth that people may not have accounted for. Maybe they did account for, but maybe they weren't able to efficiently or effectively push forward something that needed to be done. For example, to implement the system they wanted to implement, right? So this was an example of when things go right, but also when things can go wrong in the steps 0, 1, and 2. So I hope that made sense. I hope 0 made sense, how I connected it to 0, and how I connected to the vision aspect, right? Especially over here, right? What was the vision? And then step 2 was the assessment of today, right? So where they may have gone wrong is assessing, not like for example, assessing parent readiness, right? They may not have, they may not have assessed parent readiness for the new curriculum implementation, and so they might not have put systems in place to train the parents on how to get used to the system, right? The new standards. The same thing for students. They may not have prepared the students to be ready for the implementation of the new standards. So the assessment that they would have done to see if the students are actually, like a 5th grade student who was going with the previous standards is going to be ready in 6th grade for the new standards of 6th grade, right? Maybe they didn't do that, and so maybe they did, but they didn't put the right systems in place to actually fill the gap essentially for that ended up taking place, right? So maybe they didn't do that. So these are some things where step 2 may have not worked out completely because they might have only assessed where the students are currently relative to the others in the world, but they didn't actually see if they're ready to take on the new system, for example, or the parents if they're ready, or if the teachers are actually feeling ready and trained and competent enough to be able to implement effectively the new curriculum and the day-to-day standards that they had put in place. Remember I said they had day 1, day 2. So at the top of the page, you would see day 1, and then they had like a bunch of pages for day 1, and then you would pass it out to all the kids, that day 1 set of things and stuff, right? And then for day 2, they had a different set of things and so on. And so maybe the teachers didn't have that kind of training that they could have used and stuff, right? But then, years after that, the new college curriculum to teach Common Core would implement the Common Core standards as part of the teacher training and certification process, right? But maybe the older teachers didn't have that kind of training. So maybe it'll take another 10 years or 5 years or 20 years for the kids to be, or for the parents and the teachers and the school boards and everyone to be actually ready and be in a position where they can effectively institute this Common Core, for example, right? So these are some things that people are discussing right now, right? So that was where step 2 had some questionable things over here, and step 0 had some questionable things because they may not have assessed the practicality of doing something without parent and teacher and school board and student readiness and stuff in this scenario, and also accounting for politics and all that stuff. So maybe they had something right in the step 0, but maybe they also sort of went into the ideal scenario, not practical, realistic scenario in some other aspects of step 0, and then likewise for step 1 and 2 and so on. So these are some things to keep in mind. I know this is a more involved and complicated case study, but I hope it also gives you an understanding that not everything is going to be a very, very straightforward. You have to analyze and break things down into their components. So it's not like a blanket statement. It's more like, okay, in this context, in this scenario, in this aspect of the bigger picture, you have to look at everything and stuff, right? So that's one of the lessons that you can take out of this, and inshallah, that's what we're going to consider our takeaway as we conclude, inshallah. So in homework, think about the example that we said. Think about also how in various scenarios that you might encounter in your life, whether it's like your personal relationship with other people, for example, whether it's your job, or whether it's like your own personal things that you want to do for yourself and so on. Sometimes something may not be as clear cut, so they might have subcomponents and subcategories, and you have to analyze those and assess the practicality in both of them and so on. So I hope with that, inshallah, you get an idea of this case study, and I hope it was useful in assessing how these steps work. And inshallah, I'm going to stop over here. If you have any questions and stuff, then you can ask me. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك جزاكم الله خيرا